Chris Tucker is not just a comedian. He is an eruption of raw energy, rhythm, and soul. A man who scorched his name into American pop culture as Smokey in Friday, and set the entire world on fire when he stood beside Jackie Chan in Rush Hour. His presence did more than make people laugh. It shattered the boundaries of what grace, speed, and instinctive genius could look like on screen. Rising from the grit of Georgia poverty, he clawed his way to the top to become the highest-paid comedy actor of his era, breaking through every wall with a force so fierce it felt unstoppable, a flame so blinding it made Hollywood bow in surrender. But the higher he rose, the sharper the darkness cut, losses that ripped through his heart, and a financial downfall brutal enough to crush every triumph he had ever built. Let us walk through a life forged in glory and carved in tears. Before we begin, don't forget to leave a like and a perfect 10 as a tribute to the man who lifted millions, even while carrying wounds that never heal. Some hearts are born with cracks too wide for childhood to fill. And for Chris Tucker, those cracks widened early, letting in a cold that no ordinary boy could shut out. A cold that slipped into him like winter air pushing through a broken wall. Born on August 31, 1971, in Atlanta, Georgia, he arrived as the youngest of 6 in a home already stretched thin, a small boy trying to breathe inside limits he never chose. His father, Norris Tucker Sr., worked late into the night hauling cleaning equipment through empty hallways, his fingers raw from chemicals that never washed off. His mother, Mary Louise, carried the weight of the Pentecostal church with steady hands, believing faith could hold together what income could not. Their Decatur home, with its flaking paint and walls that shivered at the slightest wind, offered shelter but little warmth. Sometimes the refrigerator held more echoes than food, and years later Chris would admit, "We didn't have much, but we had each other." And sometimes that had to be enough. And within those thin, trembling walls, he learned that laughter could soften even the harshest cold. By 6, he had discovered the strange magic of easing a room's heaviness with a grin. But being the youngest meant being the quiet shadow in a house overflowing with fatigue and whispered fears. He copied Eddie Murphy's swagger, traced Michael Jackson's steps, and turned the living room into his first stage, a stage built on survival rather than applause. When his siblings finally burst into laughter, something inside him loosened. Finally, the weight lifted, if only for seconds. But loneliness stayed. Night after night, when the last hymn faded and the house fell into uneasy stillness, Chris heard his parents counting bills behind a thin bedroom door, their voices trembling under burdens they never meant for him to hear. Years later, he said, "I used to pretend I was asleep, but I heard everything." Those nights carved truths no child should hold. Sometimes you smile not to express joy, but to keep someone else from falling apart. At 8, he felt the first sting of dismissal. A neighbor told his mother, "That boy needs to be realistic," not knowing Chris stood behind the screen door, heart sinking like the world had folded in on itself. At 10, he understood the fragility of dreams, how easily they cracked inside crowded homes where survival left no space for ambition. And at 12, on a freezing December night, he heard his father release a weary sigh, the kind only men who carry entire families can make. Wrapped in a thin blanket, listening to the wind seep through broken seams of the old house, Chris made a silent vow. He would find a way out, not for escape, but for redemption. "I told myself I wasn't going to let my family down," he'd recall years later, revealing how deeply that weight had dug into him. Yet from all this struggle, something extraordinary was forming. Not bitterness, but resilience. Not hardness, but depth. Not anger, but a quiet, unshakable faith. His mother whispered, "God will make a way." Even when her hands trembled, counting coins meant to stretch farther than they could. His father returned from long shifts with tired eyes but a steady spirit, teaching Chris that dignity isn't measured by wealth, but by how you carry what life hands you. And so in that cramped Georgia house, surrounded by hunger, cold winds, and dreams far too large for the rooms that held them, an unseen child was quietly building the fire that would one day lift millions. A fire born not from comfort, but from surviving what should have broken him, one laugh at a time. Some paths don't begin with hope. They begin with impact, the kind that knocks the breath out of you before the journey even starts. That impact hit Chris Tucker in 1989, at 19, when he climbed into a borrowed car and drove out of Georgia, with nothing but a thin layer of faith holding him together. Los Angeles in 1990 didn't greet him with opportunity. It hit him like a fist. The city swallowed him whole. No warmth, no welcome, just miles of strangers and a cold that seeped through everything. His first rented room was barely human. Peeling walls, a feeble heater coughing lukewarm air, and a mattress so thin he could feel the metal digging into his spine. Some nights he fell asleep shivering with hunger, stretching a single cup of noodles across 48 hours, listening to his stomach snarl like it resented him. But returning home meant surrendering to the same poverty he had spent his whole life escaping. And he'd rather starve in Los Angeles than suffocate in the future he left behind. He trudged miles to grimy comedy clubs because bus fare wasn't guaranteed, his shoes thinning until he could feel the ground through them. At 20, he begged for 5 minutes on stage. At 21, he endured entire nights where no one even looked up when he performed. Once, after a dead silent set in 1991, a club owner muttered, "Kid, voices like yours don't sell here." The cruelty of it sliced deeper than the night wind. Chris stepped outside, leaned against a cold brick wall, stared into the orange haze above the city, and whispered, "I didn't come this far to go home empty." Years later, he admitted that in that moment, he could almost hear his mother saying, "God will make a way, baby." That whisper became a lifeline. Every sunrise where he couldn't afford breakfast, every night he walked home alone, wondering if people back in Georgia had been right. All of it fed a fire inside him. His high-pitched, explosive delivery, once mocked as too strange, too fast, or too much, slowly hardened into something sharp, dangerous, unmistakably his. Then came the night everything tightened into a single, trembling point. 1992, Def Comedy Jam. Backstage, his heart slammed against his ribs, palms slick with sweat, and every humiliation, every empty plate, every cold walk across LA pressed on him at once. He later said, "It felt like all the no's were standing in front of me that night. If he failed now, there might not be another tomorrow." But when the spotlight hit, instinct ignited. His energy detonated. His timing crackled through the room like live wire. The audience didn't just laugh, they erupted, the kind of explosive roar that changes the temperature of a man's life. For the first time since arriving in Los Angeles, Chris Tucker felt the world pivot toward him, as if all the nights he'd suffered were suddenly pointing to this one moment of recognition. It wasn't applause, it was oxygen. Momentum finally carried him to House Party 3 in 1994, a role so small most people would have missed it. But for Chris, it was nothing short of a miracle. It was the first time Hollywood didn't slam a door in his face, the first moment he felt the universe say, "Not yet, but soon." And soon arrived in 1995, wrapped in the form of a single audition that felt less like an opportunity and more like a breath of fate. Smokey in Friday. But fate has a cruel sense of humor. Instead of opening its arms, it tested him again. His first audition was a collapse, the kind that drains the color from your face. He was exhausted, his timing off, his voice unsure, his spark flickering like it was begging not to die out. When he walked out of the room, it felt as if Los Angeles had finally succeeded in breaking him. He later admitted that the short walk back to his car that day felt longer than the drive from Georgia. He sat behind the wheel, hands trembling, and whispered to himself, "Did I just lose the one thing I prayed for?" That's when the miracle arrived, disguised as kindness. Angela Means, who would soon play Felicia, saw through the thin armor he tried to wear. She noticed the fear in his eyes, the kind of fear only someone who has tasted both hunger and hope at the same time can carry. She invited him into her home, fed him a warm meal he didn't know how much he needed, and rehearsed lines with him deep into the night. She didn't just help him practice, she reignited the flame LA had tried to smother. Meanwhile, director F. Gary Gray fought behind closed doors, pushing back against studio doubt, insisting Chris deserved one more shot. It wasn't just advocacy. It was a man recognizing destiny when others only saw risk. So when Chris walked back into that room for his second audition, something inside him had shifted. He wasn't there to read lines. He was there to reclaim everything the city had tried to steal from him. What happened next wasn't acting. It was combustion. He riffed, improvised, filled the space with a wild, irresistible rhythm no script could contain. 60 to 70% of Smokey, the lines the world would quote, the scenes that would become legend, poured straight out of Chris's instinct, raw and electric. When he stepped outside after the audition, the air felt different, lighter, warmer. He wasn't a desperate kid begging for a break. He was the heartbeat of a film that suddenly couldn't exist without him. And in that moment, Chris Tucker understood something he had never dared believe. The hunger, the cold, the humiliation, the nights he walked alone, none of it had been punishment. It had been preparation. Every rise has a moment when the air changes, when the world goes still for just a breath, as if destiny is pulling back a slingshot so violently that something must break. And by the mid-1990s, after years of hunger, humiliation, and nights whispering prayers into the dim glow of cheap Los Angeles motel rooms, Chris Tucker felt that tension stretching him to the edge of himself, until the shot finally snapped. In 1995, Friday premiered, and the blast tore through everything. Audiences didn't just laugh at Smokey, they held onto him like a lifeline. Critics called Chris the film's lightning bolt, the spark that turned a tiny neighborhood comedy into a cultural monument. Strangers yelled, "Damn!" from across parking lots, and Hollywood, slow, skeptical Hollywood, finally looked up. But fame can be crueler than obscurity. Chris earned barely $5,000 for the role that made him a star. He was still living small, still unsure, still walking that thin, trembling wire between breakthrough and heartbreak. Friday changed my life. But it didn't change my situation, he would later admit. And so he stepped forward, onto a narrow bridge built from applause on one side and uncertainty on the other, never knowing the next spark would ignite a firestorm. Friday had cracked the door open, but the next chapter would blow it off its hinges. In 1997, at just 26, he crashed into The Fifth Element as Ruby Rhod, manic, dazzling, unforgettable. "People didn't expect me in a movie like that, so I made sure they couldn't forget me," he said. They didn't. Overnight, the boy who once stretched noodles to survive was suddenly being hailed as Hollywood's most electric new force. Yet with every headline, he felt something tighten inside him. The air in the rooms grew thinner, the expectations heavier. Being a young black star in Hollywood meant carrying not just your own dreams, but the weight of proving you deserved the space you stood in. And the industry wasn't loosening its grip. It was only winding him tighter. Then 1998 arrived, and Rush Hour didn't just open, it detonated. Paired with Jackie Chan, Chris unleashed a collision of speed, rhythm, and instinct so sharp it felt almost supernatural. The film roared to $244 million, hurling him into global superstardom at 27. The world saw the whirlwind, the charm, the unstoppable spark, but not the man slumped in a freezing trailer between takes, rubbing swollen eyes after another 18-hour shoot. "People saw the jokes, not the exhaustion," he confessed. Jackie Chan would later say, Chris sometimes walked onto set looking drained in a way that wasn't physical. The kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying a billion-dollar franchise on shoulders already scarred from years of struggle. And still, the world demanded more. Louder laughs, bigger scenes, a brighter spark. By 2001, the storm had turned supernova. Rush Hour 2 obliterated expectations with $347 million, and Chris earned $20 million, an impossible number for the child who once listened to his parents whisper over unpaid bills in a cold Georgia night. Hollywood crowned him the highest-paid comedic actor alive. But at 3 a.m., sitting alone in his trailer, voice shredded, hands trembling after take, Chris sometimes stared at his reflection, eyes red, spirit stretched thin, and whispered, "Why does success still hurt?" That question would echo louder in 2007, when he signed the historic Rush Hour 3 contract, $25 million plus 20% of profits. A triumph for the industry. A weight he could feel pressing into his ribs. And as he climbed higher, the ground beneath him began to split, quietly at first, then with a pain sharp enough to feel like destiny demanding a price. His bond with Ice Cube, once forged in hunger, laughter, and the raw desperation of two young men fighting to be seen, started to tear in ways neither fully understood. Cube reached out for Next Friday in 1999–2000, hopeful they could revive the magic that once reshaped American comedy. But Chris, standing at the crossroads of fame and a deepening spiritual rebirth, felt pulled toward a different truth. "I couldn't do those jokes anymore," he admitted, not as an excuse, but as a confession that cost him. Hollywood called it a creative disagreement. What it was, in reality, was heartbreak. Cube felt blindsided, left behind by a brother he believed would forever walk beside him. Chris felt wounded, punished for choosing conscience over career. Friends whispered, fans took sides, and the silence between the two men, once filled with laughter and brotherhood, grew so heavy it felt like a tombstone laid over a friendship neither knew how to save. It was a wound they never yelled about, never confronted, but both carried quietly. Proof that sometimes the deepest fractures are the ones left unspoken. And beneath that fracture lived a painful truth. The higher a man rises, the more the world tests what, and who, he's willing to lose. Then came the disappearance. From 2007 to 2011, Chris Tucker slipped from Hollywood's spotlight, like a man stepping off stage after the music stops. Slowly, silently, with a mixture of conviction and fear that left the world confused. No films, no premieres, no laughter rolling through packed theaters. People said he quit. Hollywood whispered, "He's finished." But behind the silence lived a battle no audience would ever see. There were nights he lay awake in dim hotel rooms, staring at the ceiling, wondering if he had sacrificed too much. Momentum, fortune, legacy, for a truth only his soul could hear. Days when the phone stayed silent. Moments when doubt pressed in so hard he felt himself shrinking, unsure whether he had climbed too fast on foundations too thin to hold the weight of what he'd become. The guilt of turning down millions gnawed at him. So did the ache of friendships strained by choices, made for nothing more than the protection of his own spirit. And yet, through it all, one truth kept him standing. The same truth that once carried a little Georgia boy through cold nights and empty refrigerators. Faith isn't the absence of fear. It's the courage to move forward when fear is the only thing you can feel. And in that long, punishing silence the world mistook for defeat, Chris Tucker didn't lose himself. He rediscovered himself. Because sometimes a man must let the world go quiet before he can finally hear his own soul again. Not every collapse arrives with thunder. Some slip quietly under the door like cold air. For Chris Tucker, the darkest chapter of his life didn't begin with chaos or scandal, but with the soft thud of IRS envelopes landing on his kitchen table. In the dim glow of his Los Angeles home, those letters piled slowly, almost politely, the way storms sometimes gather on a horizon before tearing the sky open. In the early 2000s, while the world cheered him as the unstoppable force of Rush Hour, the man commanding $20 million for the sequel and $25 million plus profits for the third film, something unseen was eroding the ground beneath him. Year after year, 2002, then 2006, then 2008, then 2010, unpaid taxes accumulated like hairline fractures beneath a foundation. No alarms, no headlines, just the quiet tightening of a noose made of numbers and negligence. In 2011, the truth finally hit with the weight of a dropped anvil, roughly $2.5 million owed. And what cut the deepest wasn't the debt. It was the realization that his downfall hadn't come from enemies or bad choices, but from trusting the wrong hands. "I should have watched closer, and I paid the price," he later admitted, the words heavy with a regret that clung like smoke. What he didn't yet know was that the darkest blow was still on its way. The years that followed felt like walking through a house where every room held a different echo of loss. In 2021, the moment came. The IRS lawsuit, $9.6 million demanded. The night he opened that notice, his home felt like a soundstage gone dark. A single lamp flickered against the walls, casting long shadows over papers covering the table like silent witnesses. The air was thick, unmoving, the way it gets right before a director calls action. Except this scene had no script. Selling his Florida home, a place built on years of hard-won triumphs, felt less like a transaction and more like watching a piece of his history lowered into the ground. For someone who grew up in a house where winter wind crept through the walls and food had to stretch farther than it should, losing a home carved a wound into the same place childhood scarcity once lived. He withdrew from Hollywood, not out of defiance, but heartbreak. The calls slowed, the lights dimmed, and Chris found himself sitting in quiet rooms where the hum of a refrigerator or the buzz of a distant streetlight felt louder than applause ever had. "People think fame protects you," he later reflected. "Sometimes it just means you fall from higher." By 2023, after years of negotiations that felt like dragging a boulder uphill, he settled the case for $3.6 million, closing the financial chapter, though the emotional weight remained folded in the corners of his memory, like an old, heavy coat he could never quite throw away. But inside that silence, inside the years, when the world whispered that he was gone, Chris Tucker was quietly stitching himself back together. When he stepped onto the set of Silver Linings Playbook in 2012, it wasn't with the swagger of a returning star, but with the tentative breath of a man relearning how to stand. The role was small, but the performance was grounded, careful, honest, like someone rediscovering his instrument one note at a time. 3 years later, under the bright lights of Atlanta, he walked onto the stage for Chris Tucker Live, and something in the air shifted. The man who once hid behind jokes now used laughter as a bridge, not to escape himself, but to reveal himself. The audience didn't just hear comedy, they heard confession. They heard a man folding years of pain, faith, mistakes, and redemption into every pause, every smile, every breath. In Billy Lynn's Long Halftime Walk, 2016, he continued this rebirth with restraint and quiet discipline. The kind of performance you give when you're no longer proving anything to the world, only to yourself. And then, in 2023, came Air, a performance not of noise, but of nuance. Chris Tucker didn't explode onto the screen. He arrived with warmth, steadiness, and a wisdom sharpened by storms the audience would never fully see. This wasn't a star clawing back relevance. It was an artist choosing purpose. His stand-up tours deepened, his jokes cleaner, his spirit clearer. He no longer leaned on chaos or bravado. He leaned on truth. He spoke softly where he once shouted. He laughed more sincerely than he ever had. And he carried himself with the calm of someone who had survived both the hurricane of fame and the desert of disappearance. He wasn't running toward Hollywood anymore. He was walking toward meaning. And in that journey, from IRS letters to spiritual clarity, from silence to rebirth, Chris Tucker became proof of something rare, that a man's worth isn't measured by the heights he reaches, but by the courage he discovers when the world goes quiet. Some heartbreaks don't crash through the door. They seep under it, quiet as a breath, slow as erosion, until one day you look up and realize the life you built is coming apart in your hands. For Chris Tucker, the deepest wound he ever carried wasn't carved by Hollywood, critics, or fortune. It came from losing the one thing he once believed would outlast every spotlight: his marriage to Asia Pryor. Long before the world shouted his name, long before airports and film sets swallowed his days, there was a brief, sacred period in the mid-1990s when Chris was still a hopeful young man, grinding through comedy clubs and praying that one day life might get easier. In that fragile, uncertain time, Asia stepped into his world not with awe for his talent, but with a calm steadiness he didn't know he was starving for. She saw him. The sincerity in his voice, the gentleness behind the jokes, the humility of someone still learning to believe he deserved love at all. Their connection didn't spark like fireworks. It glowed like a candle, small, steady, warm. They built it in whispered midnight conversations, cheap meals eaten on worn tables, and shared dreams that felt fragile but real. When they married in 1997, there were no cameras, no lavish spectacle. Just two people holding on to each other as if love alone could shield them from whatever storm waited ahead. Chris looked at her with a kind of gratitude that felt like a vow, and Asia walked toward him carrying a faith so complete it softened the whole room. And when their son Destin arrived in 1998, everything Chris thought he understood about purpose cracked open. He cradled that tiny child as if he were holding the rest of his life. Friends remembered the way Chris stared at Destin, awe mixed with fear, as if he were silently begging God to help him become the father he'd always wished he'd had more of growing up. For a while, Their home felt like a sanctuary. Mornings wrapped in soft baby blankets, evenings lit by laughter. Nights where Chris and Asia whispered hopes for a future that felt fully within reach. But storms don't always begin with thunder. Sometimes they begin with success. Because when Rush Hour exploded in 1998, it didn't just catapult Chris into stardom. It pulled him away from everything he loved. Months-long shoots devoured his time. Press tours stretched across continents. Calls home became shorter. Visits home became rarer. And exhaustion began to swallow the space where joy used to live. Asia would sit in the quiet of their home, cradling Destin as he slept, waiting for phone calls that came later and later, until they sometimes arrived with the first light of morning. Chris wasn't absent out of neglect. He was drowning in a world that demanded every version of him except the one his family needed. "We loved each other," Asia once confided to a friend, but love couldn't keep up with the speed of his world. And Chris, years later, would admit with a heaviness no interview could soften, "I tried to be everywhere, but something always paid the price." By 2003, after 6 years of trying to outrun the growing distance, their marriage reached a breaking point neither wanted but both felt approaching. The night they finally confronted it, the house was dim and still. A single lamp cast a warm, trembling glow across the room. Their son slept just a thin wall away. They sat at opposite ends of the couch, hands clasped, voices quiet, both searching for a version of this ending that didn't hurt. None existed. The words came slowly, painfully, not in anger, in resignation. When the truth finally settled between them, it wasn't a shatter, it was a surrender. Tears didn't fall right away. The silence hurt too much for that. When they finally separated, they did it with dignity. Property divided quietly, custody shared gently. But the emotional cost carved itself into Chris's memory like a scar that would never fully fade. After signing the papers, he hugged Asia longer than he intended, as though trying to memorize her warmth before letting go. And that night, when he kissed 5-year-old Destin goodnight, something inside him cracked in a way no audience would ever see. Yet even in heartbreak, there was grace. Asia never spoke ill of him, never told her story in bitterness, never used their past as leverage. She protected their son, their history, and even Chris himself, shielding what they'd built with a respect that showed just how deep their love had once run. And Chris carried the quiet lesson carved from those years, a truth sharpened by loss. Being there matters more than being successful. Not regret, not self-punishment, just a truth spoken by a man who learned too late how high the cost of absence can be. Today, at 54, Chris and Asia share a peace built from understanding, healing, and years of raising Destin into adulthood. There is no resentment, no unfinished war, just gratitude for the chapter that shaped them, softened them, grew them. Because some love stories do not end in triumph or reunion. They end in acceptance, in respect, in remembering what was beautiful even after it slipped away. And in the quiet of his life now, Chris Tucker carries one final truth. The hardest heartbreaks are not the ones the world watches, but the ones a man carries long after the home has gone silent. Every man has one story he never tells, the one that softened him before it shattered him. For Chris Tucker, that unspoken chapter arrived quietly, 4 years after his marriage ended, when he crossed paths with India Arie around 2007. It wasn't fireworks or spectacle, it was recognition. The gentle kind that happens when two people carrying their own bruises accidentally find warmth in each other's company. Chris was navigating one of the most uncertain emotional seasons of his life, trying to rebuild himself after years of exhaustion, fame, and spiritual recalibration. India, grounded and luminous, stepped into his orbit, not as a celebrity, but as a calm he didn't realize he'd been craving. She saw the tenderness behind his humor. He saw the depth behind her serenity. Their connection began not in noise, but in late-night conversations backstage, in charity events where applause didn't matter, and in quiet rooms where honesty finally had space to breathe. The beauty of their bond came from its simplicity. For nearly 2 years, from 2007 to early 2008, they found themselves orbiting each other in the gentlest way, sharing studio nights, long drives, unhurried dinners far from the spotlight. Those close to them remembered how Chris would relax in a way he rarely allowed himself to, laughing with a softness that felt almost boyish. India brought him stillness. He brought her lightness. Their spiritual rhythms aligned. Both leaned into faith. Both understood the scars that come from being examined by the world. Both had lived enough to know the difference between attention and connection. In those moments, hands intertwined during quiet prayers, whispered confessions of hopes they were both afraid to say out loud, they tasted something that felt almost sacred. A soft place to land. A breath neither of them knew they desperately needed. But even the gentlest love can fracture under the weight of two lives moving in opposite directions. By mid-2008, the roads beneath them began to split. India was entering a deep creative season, one that required introspection, solitude, and the emotional discipline of an artist shaping her most personal work. Chris, on the other hand, was stepping into the shadows of financial turmoil he had not yet spoken publicly about, IRS pressures quietly accumulating, uncertainty stretching across his days. He was fighting to stay centered, to reclaim balance, to hold on to a spiritual clarity he feared he might lose again. They were both growing, just not in the same direction, nor at the same speed. Their parting wasn't loud. It wasn't cruel. It was a slow exhale neither wanted to release, but both knew they had to. One friend would later recall India saying, "He was good for my spirit." And Chris, when referencing that period years after, spoke with a tenderness that suggested the memories were still folded carefully in a quiet place within him. Their love didn't break. It unraveled, silently, respectfully, with a kind of dignity rare in stories that never reached the ending they once hoped for. No interviews, no bitterness, no spectacle, just gratitude and a soft ache for something beautiful that arrived at the wrong time. The emotional imprint, however, lingered. India had reminded Chris what softness felt like at a moment when the world had hardened him. Chris had reminded India that joy could be light, spontaneous, and healing. Their connection, brief but profoundly meaningful, became one of those rare chapters in a life story that doesn't need a wedding, a ring, or a forever to matter. Because some loves are not meant to complete us. They're meant to restore us. And sometimes the most unforgettable love stories are the ones that don't last. The ones that arrive to mend something broken and leave when the heart is strong enough to beat again. Nothing rearranges a life faster than the moment a voice you love goes silent forever. There are losses that don't arrive like storms. They fall like a single crack that echoes through the rest of your life. For Chris Tucker, January 14, 2016, was that crack. The moment the world tilted in a way he would never fully recover from. He was 45, standing in the middle of rebuilding himself, career, faith, identity, when the call came. A pause on the other end of the line. A breath caught between two sentences. And then, the words that drained the color from the room. His father, Norris Tucker Sr., was gone. No final conversation, no warning. Just the sudden absence of the man who had shaped his understanding of strength since the days Chris was small enough to fit in the crook of his arm. Later, he would whisper to a friend, almost as if confessing a sin, "I thought we had more time." It was the kind of sentence that doesn't fade. It settles into a man's bones. Driving back to Georgia, Chris felt every mile like a memory calling him home. He passed exits he once took as a broke young dreamer, highways his father had driven countless nights after long shifts cleaning office buildings. But this time, the journey felt heavier, like he was returning to a chapter whose final page had been written without him. When he stepped into his father's room, time collapsed. The air still carried the faint trace of aftershave. A jacket hung neatly over the chair, as if waiting for Norris to pick it up. The old Bible on the nightstand lay open to a page Chris recognized from childhood. For a long moment, he couldn't move, couldn't breathe. He felt 8 years old again, listening to his father's deep voice telling him that hard work could build any life, that character mattered more than applause, that keeping your word was its own kind of wealth. Standing there in the stillness, he realized those teachings had been the scaffolding of his entire life. And now, the man who built that scaffolding was gone. But the ache that struck deepest wasn't just grief, it was regret. The kind that only comes to men who spent years believing they could always call tomorrow. Chris thought of the movie sets, the red carpets, the tours, the long flights that kept him away longer than he intended. He remembered the times he meant to visit, meant to sit on the porch and talk with his father like they used to. But life, fame, and noise kept pulling him farther away. "You don't realize how much someone holds you up," he said years later, voice low and unsteady, "until the day they're not there." Those who saw him that year described him as moving through the world with a quiet weight, as if each step reminded him of conversations he would never get back. Some mornings, he woke thinking it was all a mistake. Other mornings, the truth hit before his eyes opened. The world saw a star. Chris felt like a son who had run out of time. And yet, within the heartbreak, something shifted, not loudly, but with the same steady force that had defined his father's entire life. Chris began to live differently, quieter, truer. He prayed with more intention, loved his family with more tenderness, worked with a clearer sense of purpose, as if every joke, every scene, every moment of grace was a way to honor the man who had sacrificed so much so his children could dream beyond the walls of that small Georgia home. He realized his father had never asked for praise. He had asked for integrity. And so Chris carried that forward, into his work, into his faith, into the way he moved through the world. Because a father's legacy doesn't end when his voice goes silent, it continues in the choices his children make long after he's gone. And for the rest of his life, Chris Tucker walked with a compass shaped by his father's hands, not as a wound, but as a quiet, unbreakable light guiding him home. He had already learned what it meant to lose a pillar. The death of his father in 2016 had carved a wound that slowed his steps and softened his voice, a grief that settled deep enough to change the temperature of every room he walked into. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared him for the different kind of emptiness that came years earlier, when the world dimmed in a way no family loss ever had. The pain of losing a parent breaks you as a son. The pain of losing Michael Jackson broke him as a brother, sudden, violent, and echoing in places he never knew existed. If the wounds of strained friendships and years of fading fame weighed quietly on his spirit, the loss of Michael Jackson struck Chris Tucker like a shockwave, sudden, merciless, and soul-splitting. The world lost the king of pop, but Chris lost the man who once carried him through his darkest nights with laughter, the man who believed in him before Hollywood ever cared, the man who treated him like family. When the news broke on June 25, 2009, it didn't just hurt him, it hollowed him. He froze, fork slipping from his hand, as if the world had tilted off its axis. In that single moment, years of joy collapsed into a silence so heavy he felt his knees weaken beneath it. Their bond had been forged far from cameras, late-night calls, inside jokes whispered like secrets, gentle prayers said in quiet corners, the kind of childlike laughter that let two grown men feel safe from the loneliness fame often brings. Michael had nicknames only Chris ever heard, and a way of offering comfort that felt like a brother's steady hand. He brought Chris onto the set of You Rock My World simply because he wanted a friend close. And when Michael faced the hardest public battles of his life, Chris walked beside him into that courtroom, not out of duty, but out of loyalty. He wasn't defending a superstar, he was defending the friend who once leaned in and whispered, "Thank you for making me feel normal." Now, that memory cut sharper than grief itself, because Chris wished he had said it back. And then, without warning, Michael was gone. The announcement that he had been found unresponsive in his Los Angeles home rippled across the world. But while millions mourned loudly, Chris mourned in silence. He shut the door, turned off his phone, and sat alone in a room that seemed to shrink around him. Michael's laughter echoed in his mind, bright at first, then fading into something unbearably fragile, like a recording played too many times. His hands trembled as he scrolled to Michael's name on his old phone. He knew no one would answer, yet he pressed it anyway, and let it ring. Each ring felt like a crack through his chest, each silence like a weight being added to his lungs. For the first time in years, there would be no giggle on the line, no talk about faith or music or the strange ache of fame. Somewhere inside that crushing quiet, he whispered, "I should have checked on you more." It wasn't guilt, it was love, arriving too late to be heard. The memorial on July 7, 2009, unfolded like a global prayer. Michael's golden casket glowed beneath dim lights, lilies shimmering like fallen stars across its surface. The choir trembled through their hymns, and disbelief hung in the air like a heavy fog. When Michael's daughter, Paris, stepped forward and whispered, "Daddy has been the best father you could ever imagine," the entire arena broke. Chris felt his vision blur as he bowed his head, holding each memory tight, as if it might fall apart in his hands. He remembered a night when Michael had squeezed his hand and said softly, "You make me feel safe." That line returned now like a wave, louder than the choir, louder than the grief, reminding him in the cruelest way that the one person who understood the weight behind his laughter was gone forever. Months later, when Chris finally sat down for an interview, he spoke with a tenderness that silenced the room. "He was my friend," he said quietly, "and he made me laugh in ways no one else could." Nothing more, because anything deeper would have broken him open on camera. At home, he opened a drawer and found a small folded note Michael had once slipped into his jacket. "Thank you for today." The paper trembled in his hands, as if it still held Michael's warmth. In the years that followed, he guarded Michael's memory like a fragile flame, watching their favorite short films in quiet hotel rooms, letting the laughter wash over him like a blessing he feared time might erase. Some nights, grief struck like a punch to the ribs. Some nights, the silence felt sharper than any spotlight he had ever stood under. Because this was not just the loss of a friend. It was the loss of the one person who saw the man behind the jokes, behind the fame, behind the armor. And even now, when Chris steps into an empty room, he sometimes feels a shift in the air. Not a ghost, not a memory, just the faint echo of a laugh he once knew better than his own. A sound that reminds him of everything he gained and everything he lost. But the heartbreak did not stop with Michael. Life, as if testing the limits of how much sorrow one man could hold, began taking from Chris Tucker the very people who once built the world of Friday beside him. One by one, the voices that shaped the laughter of his youth went silent, each loss arriving like another light, going out in a hallway he once knew by heart. The first blow, the loudest laugh, the brother who burned bright and left far too soon. Bernie Mac was gone before Chris ever had the chance to even brace himself. In 2008, when news spread that Bernie's lungs had failed him, betraying him slowly, then suddenly, stealing air from a man who once seemed larger than life, Chris felt the floor inside him crack. Bernie wasn't just a comedian. He was a force of nature, a wildfire of rhythm and command, a man whose laugh could make an entire room vibrate before he even took the stage. Chris remembered the early years, two young men grinding through smoke-choked comedy clubs, carving jokes out of hunger and hope. Bernie carried a confidence that felt bulletproof. "Big man walkin'," he'd rumble, thumping Chris on the chest. "Act like God put you here on purpose." And Chris believed him, because Bernie believed in him with a conviction that rewires a young man's entire sense of worth. During Friday, Bernie's cameo as Pastor Clever became pure folklore. Off camera, he wasn't a pastor, he was the heartbeat of every trailer, the thunder in every hallway. He'd pull Chris aside and say, "You don't need their approval, kid. Make them need yours." And Chris lived by it, still does, because Bernie's words weren't advice. They were armor. But illness is a quiet thief. It stole Bernie's breath, then his power, then the warmth from the eyes that once lit up every room he entered. Chris still remembers the moment he learned Bernie was gone, how the laughter they'd shared over miles of road fell straight through the floor, as if dropped into a bottomless well. He sat there stunned, air caught in his throat, whispering into the empty room, "Not Bernie, not him." Because losing Bernie didn't feel like losing a colleague. It felt like losing the wall he used to lean on, a reminder that even giants fall, and even the brightest flames can vanish in the middle of their burn. John Witherspoon's passing in 2019 broke Chris Tucker in a quieter, more devastating way. The kind of heartbreak that doesn't shatter you all at once, but sinks into you slowly, like dusk filling a room you didn't realize had grown dark. Pops wasn't merely a comedian, nor just the beloved father figure of Friday. He was the soul of stillness on a chaotic set, the man whose presence felt like a hand on your shoulder, even when he didn't say a word. John didn't chase attention. Attention drifted to him naturally, drawn to the warmth he carried like a second skin. Chris remembered the moments between takes when John would lean in, voice low and steady, and tell him, "Son, one day you're going to see what everybody else already sees." It wasn't flattery. It was truth spoken by a man who had lived long enough to recognize greatness before the person living it could. Chris had received awards and applause, but nothing ever struck his heart the way those quiet words did. John made affirmation feel like a gift, not a performance. When the news came that John had slipped away peacefully at home, Chris didn't feel the world explode. He felt it dim. It was the kind of loss that doesn't come with sirens or urgency, the kind that settles over you like a thin blanket of cold. There was no chaos, no spectacle, just the unbearable stillness of knowing the man who played his pops had breathed his last while the world kept sleeping. It was a death that forces you to stare at the empty chair across the room and remember exactly who used to fill it. He found himself replaying their old interviews, their gentle teasing, the way John would deliver a line with that unmistakable cadence, half wisdom, half mischief, that could turn even silence into something funny. He remembered the faint scent of aftershave and peppermint whenever John walked by, and how his eyes always held the softness of someone who cared more deeply than he ever admitted. Losing Bernie had felt like losing fire, sudden, scorching, impossible to contain. Losing John felt different. It felt like losing the steady lamp in a dark hallway, the one you depend on without realizing it, until the night you reach for its light and find nothing but darkness. And just 1 year after losing Witherspoon, before Chris even had time to steady his heart, 2020 arrived with a cruelty that felt personal. Tiny Lister, Debo to the world, but Big Brother to Chris, was suddenly gone. His death hit like a lightning bolt, brutal, abrupt, leaving no room to prepare, no space to understand. On screen, Tiny was menace incarnate, a mountain with fists for warnings and a glare that froze entire neighborhoods. But off-screen, he was the gentlest man Chris had ever known, hugging like he was trying to hold the world together, praying before every meal, calling Chris Little Brother with a warmth that made the nickname feel like a shield. Chris remembered the way Tiny would pull him aside between takes on Friday, place a heavy hand on his back, and whisper, "Don't let this thing change you. Stay you." Advice spoken softly, but with the weight of someone who knew exactly how sharp fame's hidden knives could be. And when Chris heard Tiny had been found unresponsive, his breath halted. The room tilted. It felt like walking into a familiar space and discovering a load-bearing wall missing, an impossible absence, one that made the world feel structurally unsafe. Tiny wasn't supposed to vanish. Not him. Not the man whose presence filled every room with safety, not threat. With Tiny's passing, Chris didn't feel like the world lost a villain. He felt like it lost one of its last true protectors. And then, as if life wasn't finished testing how much one heart could withstand, 2021 arrived and took A.J. Johnson. This time, the grief didn't explode. It seeped in, quiet, slow, almost apologetic. A.J.'s easel had been lightning on screen, darting through the frame with that wiry, restless mischief only he could conjure. But the man behind the chaos was gentle, humble, and far quieter than anyone realized. Fame never swept him upward the way it did others. It brushed past him like a bus he almost caught a dozen times, but never quite reached. Chris remembered sharing flimsy set lunches with him, laughing over cheap trays, listening to AJ talk about wanting just one more big role to show people he still had it. He did have it. The world just didn't look carefully enough. When AJ died, quietly, without headlines, without the uproar he deserved, Chris felt a different kind of break inside him. Not a crack, a slow folding. The grief wasn't loud, it was tender, almost ashamed of itself. Losing AJ felt like losing a man who should have been held tighter, celebrated louder, protected better. His exit was soft, like easel slipping across the screen one last time, here, then gone before anyone remembered to reach out. And before Chris could catch his breath, the weight of all 4 losses settled into one crushing truth. In just over a decade, Every man who helped build the laughter of Friday, every voice, every spark, every heartbeat, had vanished. Bernie, Witherspoon, Tiny, AJ, fire, wisdom, strength, mischief. One by one, the pillars fell, until only Chris remained standing in the ruins of a film that once felt immortal. And sometimes, late at night, he sits down to watch Friday again, not to laugh, but to remember. The jokes still hit, the timing still snaps, the colors still glow. But behind every scene, he hears the echo of voices that will never answer again. What was once the movie that launched him into the world has quietly become a memorial to everyone he lost along the way. A film that once made America roar with laughter now makes Chris Tucker wipe tears from the corners of his eyes in the dark. Because time didn't just take colleagues, it took brothers, and no matter how bright the screen glows, it can never fill the empty chairs around the table where they once sat together. Alive, loud, unstoppable. Now, at 54, Chris Tucker lives a life shaped less by fame and more by gratitude. A slow sunrise following decades of storms. His net worth, estimated around $5 million, may seem small in comparison to the $25 million paychecks he once commanded, but the number tells a deeper truth. This is not the wealth of luxury, but the wealth of a man who rebuilt himself after losing almost everything. To rise again after IRS debts climbing to $9.6 million, after selling properties, restructuring finances, and clawing through years of confusion and shame. That is the real fortune he carries. His Georgia home, valued at roughly $2.5 million, is a sanctuary rather than a trophy. Brick and stone, wrapped in quiet trees and softened sunlight. The saltwater pool glimmers in the morning. A small fountain whispers at the edge of the yard. And behind a wooden barn door office, he writes, prays, studies scripture, and watches old videos of Michael Jackson the way some men revisit memories they still don't know how to hold. His Los Angeles home, 3,600 square feet of intentional calm, houses a steam room for 4, a balcony washed in California light, and walls lined with photographs of a career that has survived storms even fame couldn't shield him from. And his cars, his Aston Martin DB9, his V8 Vantage Roadster, his Cadillac Escalade, are less about image and more about chapters, the ascent, the rediscovery, the quieting. They are mile markers of a life lived twice. Yet the greatest pieces of his wealth do not sit in garages or ledgers. They walk beside him. Destin, his son, born in 1998, now a filmmaker in his own right, is the anchor that steadies him after every loss that carved him hollow. After burying friends, mentors, giants, after losing Michael, Bernie Mac, John Witherspoon, Tiny Lister, and A.J. Johnson, fatherhood became the one chapter that did not break him, but restored him. Chris often says, fatherhood is the best role I ever got, and you believe him when you see them together. Long talks about camera angles and calling, quiet prayers before sleep, laughter shared with the ease of two people who survived the same lifetime. And behind the curtain of his public life is a generosity most people never see. The Chris Tucker Foundation has provided scholarships, fed families, funded community growth at HBCUs, and supplied food and shelter to children who remind him of his own Georgia upbringing. Over the years, well over $500,000 has flowed into underserved communities, not for applause, but for healing. His charity is not performance, it is repayment to a world that once caught him when he fell. His stand-up tours now are not weapons against loneliness, but offerings of joy. His films, chosen sparingly, reflect the man he is becoming rather than the chaos he escaped. Every role is filtered through purpose. Every stage lights not his ego, but his gratitude. And beneath all of this, beneath the houses and cars, the steady routines and the careful rebuilding, there is a quieter truth Chris carries with him, one that rarely reaches the spotlight. Life did not shape him gently. He grew up with the sound of bills being calculated behind thin walls. He rose into a fame so bright it singed the edges of his spirit. He paid for mistakes that weren't his, shouldered debts he never meant to create, and weathered headlines that cut deeper than he ever admitted. He lost people he loved, voices that once filled rooms now surviving only in memory. There were years when applause felt heavy, when silence felt safer, when he moved through the world like a man trying not to disturb his own wounds. And somehow, he remained standing, not hardened, not closed off, simply changed. Softer in some places, stronger in others, carrying the kind of strength you only earn by walking through fire and coming out the other side with your heart still open. His story isn't a warning, nor a triumph. It's something quieter. The long return of someone who never stopped trying to find his way back to himself. And as we close this chapter, if his journey has lingered with you in any small way, if a moment, a memory, or a sentence stirred something gentle inside, you're welcome to share it with us. A thought, a word, a feeling. Sometimes that's enough. And from all of us here, we send you a wish that comes from a sincere place. May your days be peaceful, your health steady, your joys abundant, and your path lined with small, unexpected kindnesses. This is Golden American Stars, thanking you for spending this time with us. Wherever you are and whatever you're carrying, may life meet you with softness, and may the chapters ahead bring you more light than the ones you leave behind.